Thank you, Professor. Your time is perfect. Incredible. But you take all the time and no more. So, any question? Oui.
Sorry Lee, thanks for your talk. I have actually two questions. The age of Naledi, what are the limits of error and the datation? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so the first one is very easy. That date of around, and I'm being a little broad there, but 230 to 336 was sort of the age that we gave. That was the total limit. I will tell you that insider information would hold it very close to the 250,000 year mark is our best guess, both direct dating and looking at the small flow stones and bounded flow stones. Even if the ESR and the U-series and all the other dating methods were wildly wrong, it would be fairly impossible for them to be beyond a marker of maybe 50 to 100,000 years in either direction beyond that. We kind of knew that from the beginning. The bones are hardly fossilized. I think anyone who's seen these fossils has seen that. And that the lack of consolidation of the sediments and stuff. It's not an old deposit. So, there may be a little drift around that. And we don't know what the other occurrences are. I've been very reticent because it requires destructive sampling because they're sitting in dirt. And I've been reticent to do that given that they are so morphologically homogeneous at this stage, letting the science catch up, that maybe advance a little bit for just a few more years.
Second question would refer to the skeleton themselves. If it's the same species, can you think that it should be actually, well, it's probably an endemic species, and you may have a lot of interbreeding?
Brigitte, in your micro.
I'm in.
Yeah,
okay.
Thank you.
It's on. Yes. So it's one species and very restricted in the vicinity. You might have a lot of interbreeding, so that's maybe why you would get some weird features. Your comment on that? And linked to that, Florisbad, which is not very well dated, much older, but I think it's quite different in terms of morphology, right?
Let me answer the last part first. I don't think there is a date for Florisbad. And I don't think you can say it's older or younger. I don't know. It could be anything. And I think what Naledi does show is you shouldn't use morphology to date hominid species. And so I would just simply not put a date to, for the time being, Florisbad until we investigate its context with a great deal more effort. Is Homo naledi an endemic species? I have no idea. If Homo evolved in East Africa, no, it's not an endemic species. It obviously came from East Africa at some point, and with its primitive characters, you have to ask the question: did it re-evolve those, or did it bring them with it and remain as a ghost lineage? There are plenty of things that we find. I think someone mentioned earlier, don't worry about the gaps. I think that we sometimes worry too much about the gaps. This hominid exists in this time and place, but there's no indication in its anatomy that it's a localized species, that it's a long-distance walker. It has almost no hypoplasia, so it's very unstressed in its environment. It seems to be living, some of them to a ripe old age, some not so. And interestingly, as I understand talking to people who work on inbreeding and small populations, it's showing exactly the opposite of what you would see if it were having heavy inbreeding. Its homogeneity and its consistency in its anatomy is not what you would generally expect in a heavily inbreeding population over some time. So, but again, we don't have a lot of these occurrences like this in the hominid record, and so I think we have to treat it with a great deal of caution at this moment. But it also, we can't ignore it. We can't just say, well, because we knew how Homo sapiens evolved, or at least we thought we did, and yet this drops into the middle of it. You have to include that now in all those examinations of those studies. And why I say that's important is because when you start examining the occurrence of the sort of assuredness of Homo sapiens, it sometimes is a little bit of a house of cards that falls apart under investigation. There are a lot of assumptions built in. I'm not in any way saying what probably people think I'm saying, that those aren't real and that we aren't observing a real origins of Homo sapiens in these coastal sites and other places. But I think it requires, you at least have to deal with the fact that this small brain hominid exists in the time, in the space, and is absolutely certain in its morphology and abundance within that.
Yes, Zélé?
So Lee, since I'm sitting next to you, I want to poke your brain a bit. So you rightly said morphology should not be used for dating. I think in this context I agree, even though I do believe in biochronology in other creatures or species. Given that, so we have now Homo sapiens in Jebel Rud at 300,000-ish, then Hirto at 160, and then Kibish at about 200,000. And we know how big the brain is, what their morphology is. So given that Naledi is sitting at around, let's say, 300,000, it would be very hard to make it ancestral to Homo sapiens directly, one. Second, if you're not using morphology, what allows you to think that it could have much deeper origins?
Okay, so I don't have an answer for you. Because Naledi kind of fell onto us with its very surprising date, it does give me a great deal of pause for lots of the biochronology we use. Because if that can happen in a species where, cultural species that we've spoken to, issues around that, then maybe we have had an over-reliance on biochronology in certain regions in Africa. I don't think we understand what the potential. I think it raises a flag to a blind use of biochronology, particularly when it's based on a limited number of specimens and not a well-established community of animals. And so I think we have to be cautious. I think it raises a very real red flag for that. And the reason I would also be cautious. I think we're all aware that there is an argument that Homo sapiens interbred with another species in Africa around 200,000 years or so. There's a genetic argument for that. And all of the sort of the molecular studies that are occurring showing there's quite a bit of fluidity in the potential of interbreeding with species. And I think we have to be careful with the term ancestral. So I would never argue that a hominid is ancestral to another, but I don't think anyone should. I often get accused of saying, oh, Sediba is ancestral to the genus Homo. All I said in original papers was that was one hypothesis that should be considered because it could be a very ancient species. I don't stand by that in any deep way. But could Homo naledi have contributed to anatomically modern humans and some of the morphologies that it seems to share that, say, Homo erectus doesn't with modern humans? It's possible. And could that then be what's drawing it in a cladistic analysis of the head towards that position as an equal likely ancestor? Yes, because those specimens that you rightly point to all are very robust. They bridge the edge of, and I think I've had correspondence with Jean-Jacques about this, they bridge the edge of sort of what modern human variability is. And I think you're right, but I think they are on the edge, and we're continually pushing that boundary. Could there be interbreeding with more gracile species that contribute a small bit of DNA that comes in? The answer is possibly. And could Homo naledi have had a unfortunate encounter with humans or a fortunate encounter, whichever it is, and we picked up some of that? I think that's a possibility. I don't think we, right now, with the pace of discovery and what we're finding both in the molecular record and the fossil record, we have to assume that those sort of situations that we know occurred in the recent past of human history likely occurred with other hominids in the deep past.
Thanks, Lee. One more question. President?
Only if there's not a question from the experts. Professor Berger, let me quote what Yves Coppens said earlier, sort of in passing at the end of the discussion session. I understood him to say, and he will correct me if I quote him wrongly, the notion of species in humans is probably to be treated carefully as a concept because of culture. Could you comment on that deep and big statement?
I think that's a wonderful question to end on, particularly with Homo naledi, and luckily there won't be a follow-up question if I'm fortunate. I think that Homo naledi is a superb example of almost the ideal species to have found at that temporal period, because it is so extremely different from large-brained Homo sapiens. I think very few people would argue, looking at its holistic anatomy, that it is just an extent of Homo sapiens, and I think that's very fortunate for us. We're, though, as a team, not going to let you get away with ignoring the fact that it is likely, and I think you're going to see some very strong evidence. I more than think, I know you're going to see some very strong evidence that this is a very culturally sophisticated species. In many ways, as culturally sophisticated perhaps as we won't see Homo sapiens doing for another 150 to 200,000 years. And that's something special. And and we're going to have to adjust to that brave new world. And also, I would add to that I would thus argue that Homo naledi is not human. I wouldn't use the term human, yet it's doing some things I would suspect that many of you will consider when you see the evidence that we put forward were previously considered to be the domain of not just humans, but Homo sapiens and anatomically modern and later Homo sapiens. And I think that's very exciting. I think it's challenging, and I don't know how we'll sort that out with a complex archaeological record, but I think it's a good problem to have and a refreshing one. When the problems we've often faced with other species, and I faced it with Sediba and still do, the proximity of it to Africanus and other gracile Australopithecines, or Homo habilis, or Australopithecus habilis, or whatever you throw in, it doesn't seem to be there with Homo naledi. And that, therefore, makes it extremely valuable to target concepts like that. Thank you very much.
So, thank you, Lee. I guess that it's time to stop now. Tomorrow morning, the fourth session shall be around the early human out of Africa, and we shall begin at 9 a.m. Okay? Have a good evening and a nice dinner. Thanks for all.